So, is history even worth studying? Is it one of those worthless subjects that you hear about? I would say no, because the skills are going to be useful in pretty much any endeavors you go into. You're going to have to track change over time. Uh, Finance, change over time is extremely important. I just googled change over time, and these are the image results that I got back. So the kind of analysis that looks at time and forces you to come up with something about it is extremely important. You're going to have to use that in a lot of different contexts. So I think it gives you some value for that. Uh, there's different scales where the value can come in. So most of you have probably written a resume if you've ever applied for a job. So up to around 70% of Americans in various surveys have admitted that they lie on a resume. So, a resume is your work history. You're writing that history in order to impress an employer that you have the skills needed to uh, do whatever job you're applying for. So, more than two-thirds of Americans report that they lie on them. Uh, you do that for a reason. That's an example of manipulating history, and this is where the historical sense comes in. Uh, History can be manipulated. History is different than the past. There's the past of what jobs you did in previous years, and then there's the the narrative of the jobs that you did in the past that you write about. Those two things are distinct. So, writing a resume and fudging it a little bit, upgrading your job title from uh, cashier to customer service representative, uh, that kind of thing is an example of historical interpretation. And, it can be true that you are a customer service representative uh, instead of just a cashier, because a cashier has to help customers out at various times and all kinds of things. So, that's an example of working the story in one way or another. Another example I use is relationships. When you want to start a relationship, you usually want to know about the person's relational past. If the person hid something from you and you find out about that in the future, you're not going to be happy for good reason. So let's say you got married and you suddenly find out that your spouse had a previous marriage that they never disclosed to you. You'd probably feel very betrayed that they hid that part of their life from you in all the time you were dating. And that would set the marriage up for failure, probably, because there was that huge omission, basically a lie of omission. So that's another example of how history can be manipulated on a small scale. You can omit various facts from the past or interpretations and just ignore them. So if there's something inconvenient that you don't want to mess the story up, you just don't divulge it. So that's a small scale example. A medium scale example of history interpretation and manipulation is appeal to a golden age or nostalgia. And we have a great example of that just recently in the last presidential campaign. President Trump's slogan was "Make America Great Again." So the again is the key word there, because that implies that at some time in the past America was great. In the recent past or present, it no longer is. And so if you behave a certain way, you'll be great again. And this is a basic sales tactic that works really well. And In this case, it makes people imagine the past in a certain way where they think of whatever time was great. So when was America greatest? When do you think it was greatest? And Americans have actually been asked about this in various surveys. They were all over the place. So the greatest year, according to all Americans, there was no one answer that really stood out among the others. You can see here the range generally corresponds with how old the respondents were. People tended to choose the year that was about their age 5 to 10 time period when they were children. So when you get older than about 15, you stop thinking America was great. That was kind of the pattern in these results. But the number one year that most people chose was the year 2000. You can see this one had the most frequent responses. So that does say something about how Americans perceived their own past. But like I said, it was all over the place, and there was one awesome person that put 1776. I'll hand it to them. Another important part of the historical sense is recognizing large-scale manipulation, and so a way I illustrate this is through the movie Schindler's List. Have you ever seen it? If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's pretty relevant for the Warren Society class, and or really in History 203 as well. So the clip that I'm going to show is related to the context of Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939-40, and then the occupation from 1940 to 45. So Germany invaded Poland in 1939. We'll talk about that more later in the class. The particular movie clip is set in Krakow, Poland, which is in southern Poland. And in Krakow, there was a Jewish district of the city called the Kazimierz district. The Kazimierz district. And the Kazimierz district had been around for a very long time, over 500 years, and or about 450 years prior to World War II. And the district was set apart from the city because it was the Jewish district. And it was the Jewish district because King Casimir III of Poland, also called Casimir the Great, he allowed the Jews to settle, this group of Jews to settle in Krakow. They were kicked out of various other parts of Europe, especially Russia. This is kind of relevant now. During the Black Death, the bubonic plague in Europe in the 14th century, a lot of people blamed Jews for being quote unquote dirty, and there were riots, which in some cases just turned into mass murders of Jews for supposedly spreading the pestilence around Europe. And so Jews were kicked out of a lot of various parts of Europe. King Casimir of Poland, 500 years prior to World War II, in the 14th century, allowed Jews to settle in Krakow. But they were set apart in a particular district, which they named after him, as kind of a gesture of respect. So that district remained a Jewish district for hundreds of years and in the city. And when the Nazis invaded in 1939 and then occupied Poland after that, they forced all the Jews in the region to get into a smaller section of the Kazimierz district, what was called the ghetto, and concentrated them down into there. So what the movie depicts is the liquidation of the ghetto and the movement of the people that were forced to live there, the Jews that were forced to live there, into various camps. Some of them work camps, some of them concentration camps or prisons, and some of them death camps. during the Holocaust. And so the movie depicts this initial registration and movement process. The movie makes it look like this all happened really quickly. It was actually a longer process, but the drama of it does play out. Had the Nazis succeeded, what their goal was to eliminate the memory of the Kazimierz district ever being Jewish. Because what they started to do once they removed the Jews was remove all the street signs, remove all the documentation that indicated Jews lived there, all the various historical markers or any kind of historical documents related to Jews living in that area. Had the Nazis been successful because of their purge of all the relevant documentation about Jews in that area, this primary source here, this woodcut, would have been hard to interpret. You would have thought the Kazimierz district was just some other part of the town. You wouldn't have been associated with Jews anymore because all the relevant documentation had been destroyed. So 50 years later, no one would remember that Jews ever lived there, because the Nazis not only wanted to destroy the people, they wanted to destroy the memory of the people. They called it cultural contamination. They wanted to eliminate that. So this is an example of kind of large-scale historical sense, and being able to sense and recognize large-scale manipulation of history, and the importance of sources and the context of those sources.
Today is history. Today will be remembered. Years from now, the young will ask with wonder about this day. Today is history, and you are part of it. 600 years ago, when elsewhere they were footing the blame for the Black Death, Kazimierz the Great, so-called, told the Jews they could come to Krakow. They came. They trundled their belongings into the city. They settled. They took hold. They prospered. In business, science, education, the arts. They came here with nothing. Nothing. And they flourished. For 6 centuries, there has been a Jewish Krakow. Think about that. By this evening, those 6 centuries are a rumor. They never happened. Today is history.